The wind, a ghost with a throat of grit and sand, was the only true citizen of these high plains. It spoke a language older than memory, a dialect of dust and desolation that scoured the land down to its bones. It was a sculptor of loneliness, carving long, mournful shapes into the bluffs and whispering through the brittle skeletons of sagebrush. In the center of this immensity, swallowed by the ochre emptiness and the bruised purple of a perpetual dusk, sat a cabin. It was less a home and more a wound on the landscape, a place where hope had come to die. The wood was bleached gray, the roof sagged like a weary shoulder, and around it a fence of splintered posts leaned at defeated angles, a broken promise of protection against the vast, hungry silence. This was the world of Mai Ling. And for 5 years, she had been its sole, silent inhabitant. Her life was a ritual of grief, a metronome of loss ticking away the seconds in an empty room. Her husband, Lian, had been a man with hands as strong as river stones and a laugh that could startle birds from a tree. He had come to this country to build a railroad, to lay down the iron veins that would carry the nation's blood. Instead, the nation had taken his. A misplaced charge of dynamite, a rock slide, the company men had said. An accident. They had given her a pittance and a small parcel of land nobody wanted, a place where the sun was a hammer and the winter a blade. The nearby town, ironically named Redemption, had offered no such thing. They saw her not as a widow, but as an omen. Her slanted eyes, her quiet ways, the strange, musical cadence of her grief, it was a language they did not understand, and so they feared it. They had stripped her of her name, calling her only the China woman, a label that was both a description and a sentence. She had long ago stopped going to town, her supplies delivered once a season by a grudging boy who left the crate by the road and fled as if her sorrow were contagious. So she existed. She tended her small, stubborn garden. She patched the roof. She sat in the single chair at her small table, staring at the empty one opposite, where Lian used to sit. She had not spoken a full sentence in years. Her voice, like her heart, had become a quiet, fallow thing. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, they came. They did not ride in with whoops or thunder. They simply appeared at the edge of her broken fence line, 10 figures on horseback, materializing from the twilight like spirits summoned by the dying light. They were Comanche. Their faces were impassive, carved from the same hard earth as the mesas around them. Their hair was long and black, their bodies lean and corded with a strength born of hardship. They sat their mounts with a stillness that was more unnerving than any war cry. At their head was a man whose presence was a quiet gravity, drawing all light and attention to him. A long, pale scar cut a severe line down his cheek, a roadmap of past violence. He did not look at the cabin as a prize, but simply as a fact on the land. He looked at her. Mai Ling stood on her porch, a bucket of water frozen in her grip. Her heart, a dormant, hibernating thing, began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. Years of whispered warnings, of tales of savagery and blood, screamed in her mind. But their eyes held no malice. There was no fire of conquest, only a deep, bottomless weariness. They were not warriors on a raid, they were survivors seeking a moment's pause. The leader dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate. He did not approach her. He walked to her well, the one Lian had dug with his own 2 hands, and looked into its depths. He looked back at her, a silent question. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to his men. They made their camp there, 100 yards from her door, a circle of quiet men and tired horses. They did not speak to her. They did not look at her again. As darkness consumed the plains, Mai Ling retreated inside, barricading the door with the heavy chair. She sat in the dark, listening to the murmur of the wind and the new, alien sound of a small, contained fire crackling in the night. She was no longer alone, and the terror of it was matched only by a strange, unnameable ache that felt almost like hope. The first days were a lesson in the language of silence. Mai Ling lived behind her window, a prisoner watching her captors, except they made no demands, built no cage. The 10 men moved with an economy of motion that was a kind of poetry. They were a part of the landscape, not an intrusion upon it. They drank from her well, a silent transaction she had approved with a nod. They tended their horses, their hands gentle and sure. They sat and stared into the distance, seeing things in the empty air that she could not. Their leader, the man with the scar, she began to call kills the wind in her mind, for he seemed to command the very air around him with his stillness. He was the center of their small universe, and his silence was the most profound of all. It was not an empty silence, but a heavy one, filled with history, with loss, with a dignity that the chattering men in redemption could never comprehend. There was a tension, a fragile membrane of distrust stretched between the cabin and the camp. She expected violence, a sudden rush on her door, the fulfillment of every fearful story. But it never came. Instead, on the third morning, she opened her door to find a skinned rabbit lying on the porch step. It was perfectly cleaned, its small body a stark, pale offering against the weathered wood. There was no sign of who left it. She stood for a long time, the cold air raising goose flesh on her arms. It was a test. Or a gift. Or perhaps both. Her pantry was nearly bare, the coming winter a growing dread in her bones. She hesitated, her fear warring with the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Then, with a decisive movement, she picked it up and took it inside. The smell of roasting meat filled the small cabin for the first time in years, a ghost of a life once lived. It felt like a betrayal of her grief, and yet, it was also an affirmation of life. That evening, as twilight settled its lavender cloak over the plains, she returned the gesture. She filled a small clay bowl with cooked rice and the last of her dried peppers and onions. She placed it on the same porch step, a silent answer to their silent question. She did not wait to see who took it. But in the morning, the bowl was empty, wiped clean. A new ritual began, a conversation held without a single word. Some days, it was a brace of quail. Other days, a piece of dried venison. She would answer with what she had, a small loaf of bread, a portion of her vegetable stew, a handful of precious herbs from her garden. They were mending something, not with wooden nails, but with these small acts of reciprocity. They were rebuilding the broken fence between two worlds, not with posts, but with provisions. The narrator might say that humanity's greatest failing was its reliance on speech, on the clumsy, inadequate architecture of words that so often built walls instead of bridges. Here, in the vast, unforgiving quiet, two solitudes had found a way to speak a true language, the grammar of shared need, the syntax of mutual survival. One afternoon, she watched as one of the younger braves meticulously rewrapped the grip on his lance with fresh leather. His focus was absolute. He was not merely fixing a tool, he was honoring it. She looked at her own hands, at the calluses Leanne had so often kissed. She picked up his old wood axe, its handle smooth from his grasp. She began to clean it, to sharpen the blade against a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape a prayer to his memory. From his camp, Kills the Wind watched her. He did not smile, but the harsh line of his mouth seemed to soften for just an instant. He saw. He understood the ritual. He knew that some scars are not on the skin, and some tools are meant to mend the soul. The sky had been a flat, metallic grey for days, a lid pressed down on the world. Then the wind changed. It began to howl, a low, mournful cry that rose in pitch until it became a shriek. The air grew thick with a blinding whiteness. The blizzard came not as a storm, but as a predator, a great white beast of ice and fury that descended upon the plains to devour everything. Meiling's cabin groaned under the assault, the wind tearing at the roof and rattling the window panes like angry fists. Inside, huddled by her small fire, she felt the cold seep through the walls, a physical manifestation of her own deep, internal chill. She looked out the window, her breath fogging the glass. She could barely see the Comanche camp through the maelstrom, just blurred shapes and the desperate whipping of their buffalo hides. Their horses stood with their backs to the wind, heads hung low, caked in ice and snow. They were going to die. The thought struck her not with a sense of grim satisfaction, but with a horrifying, familiar pang of loss. She saw Leanne. She saw him in the mountain pass, the company men's words echoing in her memory. He froze. Nothing to be done. The cold had taken him. Now it had come for them. She watched the hunched figures, enduring the unendurable with that same terrifying stillness, and the wall she had built around her heart began to crack. She could not watch another life be extinguished by the cold. Grief, she was learning, was not a shield, it was a mirror. And in their stoic suffering, she saw her own. Her body moved before her mind could protest. She threw another log on the fire, pulled her thickest shawl around her shoulders, and unbarred the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the wall. A blast of snow and ice filled the room. She fought her way onto the porch, her voice a raw, rusty thing torn from her throat. "Hey!" It was a croak, barely audible above the storm's roar. They did not hear. She staggered forward, leaning into the gale, and pointed with a desperate, trembling finger toward the barn. It was a dilapidated structure, its roof patchy, its walls full of gaps, but it was shelter. It was life. She pointed again, a frantic, repeated gesture. Through the swirling white, Kills the Wind looked up. His face was a mask of ice, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He saw her, a tiny, defiant figure against the rage of the storm. He saw her pointing. He saw the offer. For a long moment, he simply stared, and in that gaze, an entire history of broken treaties and false promises passed between them. But he also saw a shared humanity, a flicker of warmth in the heart of the frozen world. He gave a single, sharp nod. The movement was barely visible, but it was an answer. With quiet efficiency, his men gathered their horses and their gear and moved, a line of weary ghosts, into the relative sanctuary of the barn. The next day, the storm had not broken. The world outside was a formless, howling void. Inside her cabin, Myling worked. She filled her largest pot with water, adding bone broth, dried roots, and salted meat. It was most of what she had left. As the stew simmered, its hearty aroma a defiant act against the blizzard, she wrapped the heavy pot in blankets and carried it, a precious offering, to the barn. The wind fought her every step of the way, a demon trying to rip the warmth from her hands. She pushed open the barn door to find them huddled together, sharing their collective body heat. The air was thick with the smell of wet leather, horse, and wood smoke from a small, contained fire. They looked up as she entered, their faces drawn and gaunt in the dim light. She said nothing. She walked to the center of the group and set the pot down. She gestured for them to eat. It was then, in the flickering firelight, that she truly saw them. She saw the fresh wounds from their last hunt, the old scars that mapped their bodies like violent constellations. Her eyes met those of Kills the Wind. He sat close, and she could see the pale line on his cheek clearly. It was old, but it spoke of a deep and terrible pain. He saw her looking. Without breaking his gaze, he slowly raised a hand and traced the scar on his own face. It was not a gesture of pride or vanity, but a quiet acknowledgement. "I see your wounds," his eyes said, "and I show you mine." In that silent, sacred moment, something profound was sealed between them. It was not friendship or alliance, but something deeper, a mutual recognition of the scars, both seen and unseen, that define a life of survival. When the world finally thawed, it was reborn. The snow melted away under a brilliant, apologetic sun, leaving the plain scrubbed clean and glistening. The air was crisp and new. But the thaw had also reached the town of redemption. Word, carried by the same boy who delivered Myling's supplies, spread like a fever. The widow was harboring savages. 10 of them. Living in her barn. The news curdled in the town's small, righteous heart. In the church, it became a sermon on moral decay. In the saloon, it became a grumbled threat. It was an affront to the fragile order they had built, a violation of the unwritten laws that separated us from them. Sheriff Brody felt the pressure first. He was a man who wore his badge like a shroud, a weak-willed peacemaker who governed a town of fearful gossips. His authority was a rickety fence, and he knew it. He was prodded into action by Reverend Blackwood, a man whose faith was not a wellspring of compassion but a hammer of judgment. Blackwood saw sin everywhere, but especially in that which was different. His God was a God of high walls and narrow gates. So they rode out together, law and righteousness, a posse of 2, to confront the abomination. They found a scene that stopped them cold. Mei Ling was outside, by the dilapidated fence line. But she was not alone. Beside her worked one of the younger Comanche braves. He was digging new post holes with a steady, rhythmic grace. She was holding the new post steady, her small frame braced against the wood. They worked in a comfortable, practiced silence. The sight of the small Chinese woman and the tall Indian brave rebuilding a fence together was so profoundly contrary to the town's narrative that it struck them dumb for a moment. It was an image of cooperation, not conflict, of creation, not destruction. Reverend Blackwood recovered first, his face a mask of pious concern. "Mrs. Chen," he began, his voice slick with false sympathy. "We came because we were worried for you. To be alone out here with these heathens. It is not decent. It is not safe." Sheriff Brody shuffled his boots in the mud, avoiding her eyes. He mumbled, "Folks are stirred up. For your own safety, and for the peace of the community, they have to move on." Mei Ling did not look at them. Her hands, steady on the wooden post, did not tremble. She continued to stare at the horizon, as if their words were just the buzzing of flies, an insignificant noise against the vastness of the plains. From the barn, Kills the Wind emerged. He moved without a sound, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows within. He came and stood beside her, not in a threatening way, but as a simple statement of fact. His presence was a silent, powerful rebuke. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken challenges. Reverend Blackwood, emboldened by his own righteousness, puffed out his chest. "The law of God and the law of man demand that you send these savages away," he declared, pointing a trembling finger at the Comanche leader. "This is a civilized land." Kills the Wind's gaze was like granite. It held no anger, only a deep, weary contempt for the smallness of the man before him. The sheriff, caught between the unbending will of the preacher and the unshakable stillness of the warrior, felt his resolve crumble. "Please," he pleaded. "Just tell them to go." Finally, Mei Ling turned her head. She looked past the reverend, past the sheriff, and looked directly into the eyes of Kills the Wind. A lifetime of silence, of fear, of buried grief, coalesced in that one look. He gave her the slightest of nods, an affirmation not of what she should do, but of her right to choose. Then she turned her gaze upon the men from town. Her eyes were not pleading or fearful. They were clear. They were calm. They were as hard as the winter earth. She opened her mouth, and a voice they had never heard, a voice that had been sleeping for 5 long years, spoke a single, unadorned word. No. The word was not a shout. It was a stone dropped into a still pond, its ripples spreading out to shatter the placid surface of their assumptions. No, it was a fence post driven into the ground. It was a barricade. It was a declaration of sovereignty over her land, her life, her choices. Reverend Blackwood stared, his mouth agape, his sermon of shame rendered impotent by one quiet syllable. This is an abomination," he stammered, his face flushing a blotchy red. "You are choosing a godless savage over your own kind. The Lord will not abide this." Kills the Wind remained motionless, a silent pillar of defiance beside her. He did not need to speak. Her word was his. Her strength was now his shield, just as his presence had become hers. Sheriff Brody saw it then. He saw that he was not dealing with a frightened widow and a band of vagrants. He was facing a fortress, one built not of wood and stone, but of a shared and profound understanding that he could never breach. The laws he represented were meaningless here. He sighed, the sound of dust settling. "I'm warning you, Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice devoid of threat, full only of resignation. "The town won't stand for it. I can't promise what men might do when they get whiskey in them." He turned his horse and rode away, the reverend sputtering behind him in a cloud of impotent fury. The confrontation was over. The silence that descended in their wake was different. It was not the silence of fear or uncertainty, but the silence of peace, of a battle won without a weapon being drawn. In the days that followed, the unspoken agreement between them deepened. The fence was finished, its line straight and true. The young brave who had helped her now took his meals with her at the small table, sitting in Leanne's chair. It did not feel like a replacement, but an honor. One evening, she brought a pot of tea out to their fire, and Kills the Wind made room for her on a log. They sat together, she, the Comanche leader, and his men, and watched the stars ignite in the vast, velvet darkness. No stories were told, no words exchanged, but in the shared warmth of the fire, a family was forged. It was a family born not of blood or vows, but of a blizzard, a mended fence, and a single, defiant word. One morning, at dawn, they were gone. They left as they had arrived, without a sound, melting back into the landscape that had birthed them. They were following the herds, following their own fading path in a world that had no more room for them. But they did not leave her as they had found her. On her porch sat a beautifully tanned buffalo hide, a gift of warmth for the next winter. The fence stood strong. And inside her, something that had been broken was now whole. Myling stood on her porch, watching the sun rise, and she was no longer a ghost. She was a sentinel, the quiet queen of her small, hard-won kingdom. Her face was turned to the horizon, not with longing for what was lost, but with calm acceptance of what remained. So what is a home? Is it the four walls that shelter you from the storm, or is it the people who stand with you in it? If you have ever felt the sting of being an outsider, a stranger in your own land, you know that the cruelest winters are the ones that rage inside the human heart. We build our fences of fear and misunderstanding, believing they will keep us safe, only to find ourselves imprisoned behind them. But sometimes a hand reaches through the slats. It offers not a weapon or a contract, but a simple recognition, a shared meal, a moment of silent understanding, the courage to say no to a world that demands you shrink. The deepest wilderness is not the empty plain or the shadowed forest, it is the unexplored territory of another person's soul. And the bravest among us are not those who conquer, but those who dare to seek shelter there, and in doing so, find their way home.